The Arizona Territory, 1887. Dawn crept across the Whitmore Ranch like a reluctant witness, casting long shadows over weathered wooden buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vast, unforgiving landscape. In the barn behind the main house, where the smell of hay mixed with the metallic temps of rusted iron, 15-year-old Ayanna sat with her back against the splintered wall, her wrist raw from the shackle that bound her to a thick support beam. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. Her dark eyes, inherited from generations of Yaqui ancestors who had walked these desert lands long before any white settler arrived, stared through a crack in the barn wall at the morning light. 3 months had passed since the Whitmores had taken her taken her as property after the cavalry raid that had left her village in ashes and her parents buried beneath the unforgiving desert sand. "She's getting worse, Martha," came the voice of Henry Whitmore from outside the barn. His boots crunched against the dry earth as he approached the heavy wooden door. "Yesterday, she tried to bite young Tommy when he brought her water. And the way she looks at us, it's like she's planning something wicked." Martha Whitmore's voice carried the sharp edge of a woman who had grown hard in a hard land. "The preacher says some of these Indians can't be civilized, Henry. Their blood runs too wild. Maybe we should have listened when he warned us against taking her in." Ayanna understood every word. The Whitmores assumed she knew no English, but her father had been a trader who spoke 4 languages. She had learned to hide her comprehension, knowing that her captor's ignorance was sometimes her only protection. She pressed her fingers against the small leather pouch hidden beneath her torn dress, the only thing she had left of her mother, containing a few seeds from their family's ancestral corn. The barn door creaked open, and Henry entered, carrying a tin plate with hard biscuits and a cup of water. He was a tall man, weathered by years under the desert sun, his face permanently etched with the kind of wariness that came from viewing everything through the lens of fear. He set the plate just within her reach, careful to stay beyond the length of her chain. "You need to learn to behave, girl," he said, his voice attempting authority but betraying uncertainty. "Mrs. Whitmore has been more than patient with your difficulties. But if you keep acting like a wild animal, we'll have no choice but to treat you like one." Ayanna's fingers slowly moved to the biscuits, but her eyes never left his face. Her native Yaqui, her grandmother had taught her that the eyes were windows to the soul, and in Henry Whitmore's eyes, she saw not cruelty but fear of her, fear of what she represented, fear of the unknown. This knowledge did not make her situation easier, but it helped her understand the prison they had built around both her body and their own minds. The sound of approaching horses broke the morning stillness. Through the crack in the wall, Ayanna could see riders approaching, 3 men she recognized as neighbors from the scattered ranches that dotted this part of the territory. Henry straightened, adjusting his belt as he prepared to greet them. "Whitmore," called out the lead rider, a bearded man named Jeremiah Cass, who owned the largest spread in the area. "Right. We need to talk about that Indian girl you're keeping." Henry stepped outside, and Ayanna strained to listen as the men's voices carried through the thin barn walls. "There's been talk in town," Cass continued, his voice heavy with accusation. "Some folks are saying you're harboring a potential threat. You know what happened over in Tucson last month? That Apache boy they thought was tame turned out to be scouting for raiders?" "She's just a child, Jeremiah," Henry replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Child who glares at good Christian folk like she's planning their demise," interjected another voice. "My wife won't even come to church knowing that. If that creature is anywhere in the area." Ayanna closed her eyes, feeling the familiar burn of tears she refused to shed. Creature. The word cut deeper than the rusted shackle around her wrist. In her village, she had been Ayanna, eternal blossom, name chosen by her grandmother for the strength and beauty she saw in the newborn child. Here, she was reduced to something less than human, something to be feared and contained. The conversation outside grew more heated. She heard Martha Whitmore join the group, her voice shriller than the men's but equally convinced of Ayanna's inherent danger. "She doesn't speak English, doesn't follow proper customs, and absolutely refuses to learn Christian ways, Martha was saying. Yesterday, I found her making some kind of heathen markings in the dirt, probably summoning spirits, or some such wickedness. Iana almost smiled at that. The heathen markings had been a map of her village, as she remembered it. Drawn in the dirt with a sticka, small act of memory and defiance that helped her remember who she was beneath the chains and fear. But to these people, anything they didn't understand was automatically threatening. The solution is simple, Cass declared. Send her to the Indian school in Carlisle. Let the government deal with her. Kill the Indian. Save the man, as they say. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Iana had heard whispers of these schools places, where children were taken to have their identities systematically erased, their haircut, their names changed, their spirits broken through isolation and punishment. Many who went to such places returned hollow-eyed and disconnected from everything that had once given their lives meaning. As the voices outside continued their debate about her future, Gianna looked down at the heavy chain that secured her to the barn wall. The iron had been forged by hands that saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. Yet despite everything's the loss of her family, the destruction of her village, the daily humiliation of being treated as less than human, something unbreakable remained. Alive within her, her grandmother had once told her that the desert wind could erode even the hardest rock, but it could never destroy the seeds that lay buried deep in the earth, waiting for the right moment to grow. Iana touched the pouch at her chest and made a silent promise to the memory of her ancestors. Whatever happened next, she would not let them erase who she was. The conversation outside was ending, and she could hear Henry's reluctant agreement to consider their suggestions. As the riders departed and the Whitmores returned to their house, Iana was left alone again with the weight of the chain and the growing certainty that her time at the ranch was drawing to a close. She did not yet know that 50 miles north, in the vast pine forest that carpeted the mountain slopes, a solitary man with gentle hands and a scarred heart was preparing for a supply run that would change the course of both their lives forever. Thomas Brennan stood 6 feet 4 inches tall. With shoulders broad enough to carry the massive pines, he felled in the forests above Flagstaff, his hands, scarred and calloused from years of working with axe and saw, were surprisingly gentle when they needed to be, a trait that had served him well in his previous life as a father. But that life felt like a distant dream now, buried with his wife Sarah and their daughter Emma beneath the Colorado snow where a fever had taken them both 3 winters ago. The forest had become his sanctuary, a place where the only sounds were the whisper of wind through pine needles and the satisfying bite of steel into wood. He had built a small cabin near a crystal-clear stream, miles from the nearest neighbor, where he could work in solitude and speak only when absolutely necessary. The lumber company paid him well for the high-quality timber he provided. His monthly trips to town for supplies were brief, fishing affairs conducted with minimal conversation. On this particular morning in late September, Thomas loaded his wagon with carefully stacked planks of pine and oak, preparing for the 3-day journey to the settlements south of Flagstaff. His horses, a matched pair of sturdy bays named Buck and Bell, stamped their feet in the crisp mountain air, their breath creating small clouds of vapor in the early dawn light. As he checked the harness for the third time, a habit born of careful attention to detail that had kept him alive in the unforgiving wilderness, found his thoughts drifting to the dreams that had been troubling his sleep. Images of Emma's laughter mixed with the sound of chains, visions of Sarah's gentle hands reaching toward something he couldn't quite see. He had learned not to dismiss such dreams entirely. The forest had a way of speaking to those who knew how to listen. The first day of travel passed uneventfully. The wagon wheels found their rhythm on the well-worn trail that wound down from the mountain forest toward the desert valley below. Thomas made camp that evening beside a small creek, sharing his simple meal of cornbread and jerky with Buck and Bell, who had served him faithfully for 2 years. As he sat by his small fire, whittling a piece of pine into the rough shape of a bird, a habit that kept his hands busy and his mind calm, he noticed storm clouds gathering on the southern horizon. The second day brought the storm in full force. Rain lashed the wagon cover, and the trail became a treacherous ribbon of mud that forced Thomas to reduce his pace to a careful walk. By afternoon, It was clear he would need to seek shelter, rather than risk injury to his horses, or damage too. His cargo? He remembered a trading post about 5 miles ahead of place he had stopped before, run by a German immigrant named Mueller, who asked a few questions and provided decent food for reasonable prices. But as Thomas approached the crossroads, where Muller's post should have been, he found only charred ruins and a crude wooden sign that read "Closed Gone to California." The storm was intensifying, and with nowhere else to turn, he guided his wagon toward a collection of buildings he could see through the rain about a mile to the east. A thin column of smoke rising from one of the chimneys suggested he might find shelter there, even if it meant dealing with people he didn't know. The Whitmore Ranch peered through the rain like something from a troubled dream. The main house was a 2-story structure that had once been painted white but had faded to a weathered gray. A barn, several outbuildings, and a small corral completed the spread. Thomas could see light in the windows of the main house, and the smoke from the chimney promised warmth and dry shelter. He was about to approach the front door when he heard a sound that stopped him cold and sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the rain.
Ow.
It was the sound of a chain, heavy and metallic, dragging across wooden planks. The sound came from the barn, followed immediately by what could only be described as a sob, heartbroken and utterly human. Thomas had heard many sounds in his years in the wilderness: the death cry of a wounded elk, mournful howl of wolves, the crack of trees falling in empty forests. But this sound was different. It spoke of suffering that was neither natural nor necessary, suffering that had been deliberately imposed by one human being upon another, moving quietly despite his size. Thomas approached the barn. Rain had softened his footsteps, and years of hunting had taught him how to move without detection. Through a gap in the wooden planks, he peered into the barn's dim interior. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. A young girl, older than his Emma would have been, sat chained to a support beam in the center of the barn. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that bore the high cheekbones and strong features of the indigenous peoples he had encountered in his travels. Her dress was torn and dirty, and the shackle around her wrist had rubbed the skin raw. But it was her eyes that struck him most forcefully: dark, defiant, completely unbroken despite whatever torment she had endured. Thomas felt something break open inside his chest, a wall that had protected him from feeling too much since Sarah and Emma's deaths. The girl's situation was an abomination that violated every principle he had learned from his own parents, who had taught him that strength existed to protect the vulnerable, not to exploit them. As he watched, the girl became aware of his presence. Her head turned toward the gap in the wall, and their eyes met for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Thomas saw no fear there, only a kind of desperate hope mixed with cautious assessment. She was evaluating him, trying to determine whether he represented salvation or another threat. Thunder crashed overhead, and Thomas knew he had to make a decision. He could approach the house, explain about the storm, spend the night as a guest of these people, and continue his journey in the morning as if he had seen nothing. It would be the safe choice, the practical choice, the choice that would avoid conflict and complication. But as another flash of lightning illuminated the girl's face through the gap in the barn wall, Thomas heard Emma's voice in his memory. "Papa, why don't the big people help when the little people are scared?" He had told his daughter that good people always helped when they could, that strength was given to us so we could protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The hypocrisy of considering walking away now was more than his conscience could bear. Thomas returned to his wagon and quietly retrieved his largest axe tool, designed for felling the mightiest trees. With a blade kept sharp enough to split hairs, he also took a heavy wool blanket and what remained of his travel supplies. Then, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who had made an irrevocable decision, he approached the barn door. The door was secured with a heavy wooden beam and a rusted padlock that looked like it had been forged during the territorial wars. Thomas examined the lock for a moment, then positioned his axe carefully. The girl inside had heard him approaching. He could see her eyes reflecting the lightning flashes, watching his every movement. "Oh, don't be afraid," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the storm. They were the first words he had spoken to another human being in over a month, and they felt strange on his tongue. "I'm going to get you out of there." The axe blade bit into the wooden doorframe just above the lock. The sound was sharp and decisive, cutting through the storm like a declaration of intent. With 2 more careful strikes, the lock assembly fell away, and the barn door swung open. Thomas stepped inside, and for the first time in 3 years, felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Ayanna had seen many men in her 15 years warriors. Traders, farmers, soldiers, but she had never seen anyone quite like the giant who stood silhouetted in the barn doorway. Lightning flickered behind him, making him appear like some ancient spirit emerging from the storm itself. When he spoke, carried a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing size. "Easy now," Thomas said, approaching slowly with his hands visible. He had dealt with frightened animals before, and something told him that this girl had been treated as little more than an animal for far too long. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Thomas." Ayanna's eyes followed his every movement as he knelt beside her, examining the shackle around her wrist. The metal was old and corroded, but still strong enough to hold her secure. Thomas's face darkened as he saw the raw, infected skin where the iron had rubbed against her wrist for weeks. "This is going to make some noise," he said, positioning his axe carefully. "But I need you to trust me." Trust. The word was almost foreign to Ayanna after months of betrayal and imprisonment. But something in this stranger's eyes reminded her of her father's steadiness, a certainty that his word meant something. She gave a small nod and pressed herself against the wall to give him room to work. The axe blade struck the chain between the shackle and the support beam with the sound of thunder. Sparks flew as steel met iron, and on the 3rd strike, the chain parted with a metallic snap that seemed to echo through the barn like a gunshot. For the first time in 3 months, Ayanna's arm was free to move. She stared at the broken chain, hanging from her wrist, hardly daring to believe it was real. The shackle itself would need tools to remove, but the chain that had bound her to this place was broken forever. "Can you walk?" Thomas asked, offering his hand to help her stand. Ayanna hesitated for only a moment before accepting his assistance. Legs, weakened by weeks of limited movement, trembled as she rose, but they held her weight. She was taller than he had expected, with the proud bearing of someone who refused to let circumstances diminish her spirit. "We need to leave," Thomas said, glancing toward the main house where lights still glowed in the windows. "The people here, they won't understand what I've done, and they might try to stop us." As if summoned by his words, the front door of the house opened, and Henry Whitmore emerged onto the covered porch, a lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other. He had heard the sound of the axe and come to investigate. "Who's out there?" Henry called into the storm. "Show yourself." Thomas moved to the barn door, positioning himself between Ayanna and the house. "Name's Thomas Brennan," he called back. "I was seeking shelter from the storm. My wagon's up on the road." Henry approached through the rain, his rifle held at the ready, but not directly threatening. As he drew closer, the lantern light revealed Thomas's impressive size and the girl standing behind him. "What are you doing in my barn?" Henry demanded. "Why is she ... His voice trailed off as he saw the broken chain hanging from the support beam. "What I'm doing," Thomas said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had made his peace with whatever consequences might follow, is what any decent person would do. "The girl is coming with me. Like hell she is." Henry raised the rifle slightly. "That Indian is dangerous, mister. She's wild and unpredictable. We've been trying to civilize her, but she's too far gone for proper Christian society." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest like floodwater, but he kept his voice level. "What I see is a child who's been chained in a barn like an animal. And what you call wild looks to me like someone who hasn't forgotten how to be human." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Martha Whitmore chose that moment to emerge from the house, her sharp voice cutting through the rain. "Henry, what's happening out there?" "Some drifter broke the Indian girl loose," Henry called. "Back. He thinks he's taking her with him." Martha's response was immediate and shrill. "She's our responsibility. Took her in when no one else would. She owes us for food and shelter." Thomas felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. "You didn't take her in. he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. You made her a prisoner. There's a difference. Behind him, Ayanna stepped forward. For months, she had listened to these people discuss her as if she were deaf or too stupid to understand. Now, with her chains broken and freedom within reach, she found her voice. I owe you nothing, she said in perfectly clear English, causing both Whitmores to gasp in shock. You fed me scraps fit for dogs and chained me in darkness. My parents taught me about debt and honor. You have earned neither my gratitude nor my obedience. The shock on Henry's face was almost comical. You, ... You can speak English? Speak 4 languages, Ayanna replied with quiet dignity. I simply saw no reason to waste words on people who saw me as less than human. Thomas felt something like pride swell in his chest. This girl had survived months of abuse while maintaining not only her intelligence, but her spirit. She was far stronger than her captors had ever realized. She stays here, Henry said, raising the rifle again. She's our ward, legally speaking. You take her, and that's kidnapping. And what you've been doing is false imprisonment and child abuse, Thomas replied. I'd rather take my chances with the law than leave her in chains. The rain was beginning to slacken, but the tension in the air remained electric. Thomas could see that Henry was afraid not just of him, but of the implications of letting Ayanna go. If word spread that he had been keeping an Indian girl chained in his barn, his standing in the community would be destroyed. Henry, Martha called from the porch, just let them go. Good riddance to both of them. We'll tell folks she ran off. In the storm. Henry wavered, and Thomas pressed his advantage. The girl comes with me, and this ends here. No one needs to know anything more than that. After a long moment, Henry lowered the rifle. Take her then. But when she causes trouble and she will don't come crying to us. Thomas wrapped the wool blanket around Ayanna's shoulders and guided her toward his wagon. Buck and Belle stood. Patiently in the rain, their ears pricked forward at the sound of approaching footsteps. As Thomas helped Ayanna onto the wagon seat, she turned back to look at the barn one last time. I am not wild, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the dampening air. I am free. As the wagon pulled away from the Whitmore ranch, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had acted on impulse, following his conscience rather than common sense. He had to figure out what came next. Beside him, Ayanna sat wrapped in the blanket, her dark eyes fixed on the road ahead. She had said nothing since leaving the ranch, but Thomas could sense the storm of emotions she was processing. Freedom, after months of captivity, must feel as overwhelming as it did wonderful. Where are we going? She asked finally, her voice barely audible above the wagon wheels and the settling rain. Thomas considered the question. His cabin was still 2 days away, hidden deep in the forest where no one would think to look for them. It would give them time to figure out a plan, time for her to heal from her ordeal. Home, he said simply. We're going home. For the first time since he had found her, Ayanna smiled. The mountain cabin that Thomas called home stood in a clearing beside a stream that sang with the voices of countless tributaries flowing down from the snow-capped peaks above, built from pine logs he had cut and shaped himself. It was modest but solid, with a stone chimney that drew properly and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. To Ayanna, after months in the Whitmore's barn, it seemed like a palace. 3 weeks had passed since the night Thomas had broken her chains. 3 weeks of healing, both physical and spiritual, in the cathedral silence of the ancient forest. The infected wound around her wrist had responded to poultices made from plants her grandmother had taught her to recognize. And the shackle itself had finally yielded to Thomas's careful work with file and chisel. But it was more than her body that was healing. Each morning brought back a piece of herself she had thought lost forever. The trees here are different from home, Ayanna said, running her fingers along the bark of a massive ponderosa pine. She and Thomas were gathering deadfall for the winter. Supply, working together in the comfortable rhythm they had developed. But they speak the same language. Thomas smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. The forest had been his teacher too, showing him how to live with solitude without drowning in loneliness. What did they tell you? Ayanna closed her eyes and listened to the whisper of wind through pine needles. That roots go deep, even when the surface is scarred. that winter always ends, that every seed contains the memory of all the forests that came before. She had been sharing more of herself lately, telling Thomas about her village, her family, the traditions that had shaped her understanding of the world. In return, he had spoken about Sarah and Emma, about the life he had lost and the guilt that had driven him into exile. They were both refugees from their own grief, finding unexpected healing in each other's company. "Thomas," Ayanna said, settling against the base of the pine with the serious expression that meant she was preparing to say something important. "I need to tell you something about the seeds." She reached into the small leather pouch she always wore, withdrawing a handful of corn kernels that had been dried and carefully preserved. "These are from my grandmother's garden. 5 generations of women in my family have saved seeds from the best ears, the strongest plants this corn knows. Our land, our seasons, our prayers." Thomas knelt beside her, recognizing the significance of what she was sharing. "You've kept them safe all this time?" "Through everything," she nodded. "Through the raid, through the ranch, through the chains. I promised my grandmother I would plant them somewhere safe, somewhere they could grow and remember who we are." She held out the seeds, their surface hard and brown, but containing infinite potential. "I want to plant them here, Thomas. In this clearing by the stream. Will you help me?" The request touched something deep in Thomas's heart. Over the past weeks, he had watched Ayanna slowly emerge from the shell of trauma that had protected her, revealing the remarkable young woman she truly was. Intelligent, resilient, connected to the natural world in ways that reminded him of the person he had been before. Grief hardened his heart. The idea of helping her plant seeds, of creating something that would grow and flourish, felt like the most important work he had ever been asked to do. "I would be honored," he said simply. They chose a spot on the southern slope of the clearing where the soil was rich and the morning sun would linger longest. Working together, they cleared the ground of rocks and debris, then carefully prepared rows in the dark earth. As they worked, Ayanna told him about the planting ceremonies of her people, how each seed was blessed and given to the earth with prayers for rain, for sun, for the continuation of life itself. "In my language, we say, YAQUI," she said, pressing the first seed into the prepared soil. "It means to plant with hope." Thomas watched as she placed each kernel with deliberate care, her lips moving in silent prayer. There was something sacred about the moment, something that transcended the simple act of gardening. These seeds carried the DNA not just of corn plants, but of an entire culture, an entire people's relationship with the land as they worked. Thomas found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't for years. What would happen when spring came and the seeds sprouted? What would happen when the corn grew tall and strong, proving that life could flourish even in places of exile? The question had been hovering unspoken between them for days. Ayanna was 15, old enough to make her own choices, but still young enough to need guidance and protection. She had no family left, no community to return to. Thomas, at 38, had built a life of deliberate solitude that suddenly felt incomplete without her presence. "I've been thinking," Thomas said as they finished planting the last row, "about winter, about what comes next." Ayanna nodded, having sensed the direction of his thoughts. "The Whitmores think I'm dead or gone forever. No one will come looking for me here." "That's not what I meant," Thomas said gently. "I meant ... if you want to stay, not just hiding." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Thomas was offering more than shelter. He was offering family, belonging, a chance to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. Ayanna looked around the clearing at the cabin that had become her sanctuary, at the man who had risked everything to give her freedom. In the distance, she could hear the stream singing its eternal song, and above them, the pine trees whispered their ancient secrets to the wind. "I lost my first family to hatred," she said finally. "My second family tried to break my spirit, but here," she gestured to encompass the forest, the cabin, the newly planted garden. "Here, I think I could learn what it means to choose family." Thomas felt tears sting his eyes, the first he had shed since Sarah and Emma's funeral. "Then stay," he said, Stay and help me remember how to be human again." As winter approached, they settled into the rhythm of life in the high country. Thomas taught Ayanna how to preserve meat, how to read weather signs, how to move silently through snow. She taught him plant lore passed down through generations, how to find medicine in the forest, how to listen to the voices of wind and water. They were building something unprecedented. Family formed not by blood or law, but by choice and necessity. And the simple recognition that they were stronger together than apart, it wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was theirs. On the first morning when frost silvered the grass around their planted seeds, Ayanna stood at the cabin window watching the sun rise over the mountains. Behind her, Thomas was building up the fire, preparing coffee and pancakes for their breakfast. It was a scene of such ordinary domestic peace that it might have existed in any home, anywhere in the world. But this was their home, carved out of wilderness and defended by courage, a place where a Yaqui girl who had survived the worst of humanity could plant seeds with hope. And a grieving lumberjack could learn that healing sometimes comes disguised as responsibility to others. "Thomas," Ayanna said, still watching the sunrise, "next spring, when the corn grows tall, we should invite people to see it. Good people who need to know that different doesn't mean dangerous." Thomas smiled, understanding immediately what she was suggesting. The planted seeds were more than a garden. They were a declaration that indigenous knowledge, indigenous people, indigenous culture had a place in this changing world. That survival sometimes meant not just enduring, but flourishing. We'll have the biggest celebration these mountains have ever seen," he promised. And in that moment, as the first snow of winter began to fall on their carefully tended garden, both of them understood that they had found what they didn't even know they were looking for: a place to belong, a purpose worth fighting for, and proof that even the darkest chapters of life could give way to unexpected hope. The seed slept beneath the snow, dreaming of spring.